The four-star general walked into our small Cumberland Ridge house, looked at the old photograph on the wall, and turned as pale as if he had seen a dead man rise. He did not ask how my dad was doing. He just stared, tightened his grip on his hat strap, and asked in a chillingly low voice, "You call this man Dad?" Instantly, I knew my ordinary father could destroy a 20-year-old empire. My name is Naomi Langley. I am 34 years old, and for the past 7 years, my entire professional life has been dedicated to finding the truth hidden at the bottom of a lie. As a senior compliance analyst at Bellwether Civic Risk, my job is to sift through mountains of corporate paperwork, audit trails, safety reports, and procurement logs to find the exact point where a corporation decides that human safety is less important than a profit margin. It is exhausting work, a daily immersion into the calculated risks taken by wealthy men in boardroom chairs. Lately, those calculations had been keeping me awake at night, staring at the ceiling of my apartment. For the past 3 weeks, I had been obsessively tracking a bizarrely anomalous inspection file for a massive, multi-state school bus retrofitting contract. The supplier was a giant entity, but the numbers simply did not align. The safety certifications felt manufactured, stamped by subsidiaries that seemed to exist only on paper. The stress had coiled so tightly in my neck, resulting in blinding migraines, that my director practically ordered me to take time off. I packed a weekend bag, left the concrete and glass of the city behind, and drove back to Cumberland Ridge to find some quiet. Cumberland Ridge was the kind of small, fading American town where silence was the primary export and routine was the local religion. It was a place of wide front porches, aging maple trees dropping their leaves onto cracked sidewalks, and neighbors who knew exactly what time you drank your morning coffee. Returning here was supposed to be a reset button for my exhausted brain. I just wanted to sit in our familiar kitchen, drink lukewarm tea, and watch my father be exactly who he had always been, my dad. Dean Langley was the maintenance manager for the local public school system. If there was a persistent leak in the gymnasium roof, a busted radiator in the 3rd grade classroom, or a jammed pneumatic door on bus number 7, Dean was the man who arrived with a metal toolbox to fix it. The entire town viewed him as utterly dependable. He was absolutely safe. He did not drink. He never raised his voice. And he never claimed credit for the extra hours he put in before the sun came up to ensure the school hallways were warm for the children. He operated like a vintage pocket watch, entirely predictable, quietly enduring, and perfectly content to tick away in the background of other people's lives. Walking into his house that Friday afternoon felt like stepping into a perfectly preserved time capsule. The faint, comforting smell of cedarwood, old newspaper, and the harsh citrus hand cleaner he used to scrub the dark engine grease from his knuckles hung permanently in the air. The house was spotless, yet deeply lived in, filled with the comfortable silence of a man who required very little from the outside world. There were no grand trophies, no expensive electronics, just the quiet evidence of a humble, steady life. There was, however, one glaring inconsistency in the carefully curated quiet of Dean Langley's existence. It hung in a plain wooden frame on the wall right above the living room bookshelf, a solitary monument to a life he never talked about. It was a photograph. The colors were slightly sun-faded after years of exposure, but the image remained sharply in focus. In it, my dad looked perhaps 20 years younger. He was dressed in desert camouflage, his face smeared with dust and sweat, standing near the twisted, scorched chassis of an armored transport vehicle. He was not smiling. His posture was rigid, and his eyes held a hard, flat distance that I had never seen in person. Beside him stood 3 other men, all holding heavy rifles, none of them wearing any recognizable unit patches, name tapes, or rank insignia. As a little girl, I used to pull a heavy wooden dining chair over to the shelf, climb up, and stare at the men in the picture, wondering who they were and what they were looking at just beyond the camera's lens. Every time I asked him about it, the ritual was exactly the same. He would walk into the room, gently lift me off the chair, set me firmly on the woven rug, and offer a vague, deflecting smile. "That is just old history, Naomi," he would say, his tone making it clear the conversation was over. "It does not matter anymore." I had eventually stopped asking. You do not interrogate a man who spends his weekends building wooden birdhouses for the community park and helping the elderly widow next door clear the autumn leaves from her gutters. You just accept that everyone has a past they left behind. And you love them for who they are in the present. At 3 o'clock that afternoon, Dad was still over at the middle school. A central boiler had shut down, and he had promised the principal he would have it running before the Monday morning freeze rolled in. I was sitting on the worn fabric of the couch, mindlessly reviewing some of the bellwether files on my laptop, enjoying the absolute, undisturbed stillness of our dead-end street. Then, the silence broke. It was not a loud noise, just the heavy, deliberate crunch of thick tires rolling over the gravel shoulder of the road. I glanced out the front window and felt a sudden, inexplicable tightening in my chest. A black, government-issue sedan had pulled up to the curb, idling with a low, predatory hum, in Cumberland Ridge. The most exciting vehicle you saw on a Friday afternoon was a rural mail truck. This car belonged to a different world entirely. The tinted windows hid the interior, but the sheer presence of the vehicle was a disruption. The rear door opened, and a man stepped out into the crisp afternoon air. He wore a pristine dress uniform adorned with 4 bright stars on the shoulders. He was an older man, tall and imposing, moving with the stiff, calculated grace of someone who had spent his entire life commanding thousands of people. Yet, as he walked up our concrete driveway, there was a visible, vibrating tension in his shoulders. He looked perfectly polite, but he was wound as tight as piano wire. His jaw clenched, his eyes fixed on the front door. I set my laptop down and opened the front door before he could even raise his hand to knock. He stopped on the wooden porch, his eyes locking onto mine. He did not introduce himself immediately. He just stared at me for a long, uncomfortable moment, as if searching my face for a resemblance he was desperately afraid to find. "May I help you?" I asked, keeping my voice steady despite the sudden racing of my pulse. "I apologize for the intrusion," he said. His voice was gravelly, carrying the heavy weight of decades of absolute authority. "My name is Everett Shaw. I'm looking for the owner of this residence. I need to come inside. There is a matter involving someone who should no longer exist." The phrasing sent a cold spike of dread straight down my spine. It was not a threat, but it carried the distinct, undeniable gravity of a disaster. I stepped back, holding the door open, my compliance instincts screaming that something was fundamentally wrong. "He is not home right now, but you can wait inside." Shaw stepped over the threshold, taking off his service cap, the moment he entered the living room. The atmosphere in the house seemed to warp around him. The quaint, small-town comfort of the furniture and the floral rugs suddenly felt incredibly flimsy, like a fragile stage set about to be violently torn down. I watched him scan the room. He took in the worn recliner, the neat stack of woodworking magazines, the old television set. He was cataloging the mundane details of my father's life. Then, his gaze swept upward and caught the framed photograph hanging on the wall. Everett Shaw stopped breathing. It was a microscopic pause. But in my line of work, you learn to read the spaces between breaths. His broad shoulders went completely rigid. All the color drained from his face, leaving a pale, sickly gray behind his weathered, sun-beaten skin. His hands, gripping the dark brim of his cap, tightened so violently that his knuckles turned stark white. He stared at the younger version of my father standing next to the burning armor in the desert. He looked exactly like a man who had just seen undeniable proof of a monstrous sin he thought he had successfully buried deep in the earth. The silence stretched, turning heavy and suffocating. The rhythmic ticking of the hallway clock sounded like hammer strikes against an anvil. Slowly, Shaw turned his head to look at me. The composed, authoritative 4-star general who had walked up my driveway was entirely gone. In his place was a man standing on the very edge of a steep cliff, staring down into the dark. when he spoke. His voice was dangerously low, fracturing on the edges. "You call this man Dad?" he asked. I nodded, my throat suddenly too dry to formulate a word. Shaw closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, a thick muscle twitching hard in his jawline. "According to military records," he said, every single word dripping with a cold, terrifying certainty. "This man should have vanished from the world 20 years ago." From that exact moment, the foundation of my entire reality cracked wide open. The gentle school maintenance man I had known for 34 years was a ghost, and whoever my father had once been was about to bring a dark empire crashing down. The front door handle turned. The familiar squeak of the brass hinges sounded abnormally loud in the tense air. My father walked in. He wore his heavy canvas work jacket, gray dust coating the sleeves, smelling faintly of rusted iron pipes and cold dirt. His heavy metal toolbox clanked against his leg. He looked down, wiping his work boots on the welcome mat, entirely unaware that the past he had buried was currently standing right in our living room. He looked up. His eyes locked onto Everett Shaw. My dad froze. It was not a look of surprise. It was a microscopic lockup, exactly half a second where all the air left his lungs, his muscles turning to rigid stone. In my line of work, I spent countless hours analyzing human reactions during corporate depositions. That half a second told me everything I needed to know. These two men did not just serve together, they shared a grave. Dad did not reach out his hand. He did not offer a polite smile. He walked deliberately to the hallway console table, set his toolbox down with a heavy thud, and took off his jacket. He turned back to the 4-star general standing in his house and spoke in a voice I had never heard before. It was flat, devoid of warmth, and utterly lethal. "You should let the dead rest, Everett." Shaw did not flinch. "The dead do not always stay buried, Dean, especially when the people who dug the hole start digging another one." I stood frozen by the doorway. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Shaw was not just a messenger. He was the architect. "I signed the documents," Shaw said, his voice dropping an octave, abandoning any pretense of social grace. The polite veneer dissolved, revealing the gunpowder underneath. "My signature is on the sealed file that confirmed Dean Langley ceased to exist 2 decades ago. I authorized the phantom status. I helped wipe you off the face of the earth." My dad just stared at him, his face an impenetrable mask. "And you want a thank you card?" "You got exactly what you wanted." I kept my mouth shut. I disappeared. That was the deal we made in the dark. "I am not here to ask for your forgiveness," Shaw replied sharply, taking a step forward. "I am not here to clear my conscience. I am here because the exact same cancer we failed to cut out 20 years ago is spreading again. And this time, it is not hitting an isolated desert outpost. It is hitting home." Shaw closed the distance between them, the brass buttons on his uniform catching the dim light. "Safe Miles America. Have you heard of them?" My breath caught in my throat. Safe Miles America. The exact corporate contract I had been tearing my hair out over at Bellwether for the past 3 weeks. The numbers that did not match up. The subsidiaries that seemed like ghosts. They just secured the National Safety Retrofitting Package for school buses across 14 states. Shaw continued, his tone clinical and hard. "It is a massive government rollout, hundreds of millions of dollars. But Safe Miles is just a new coat of paint on a very old, very rotten house." Dad crossed his arms. The veins in his forearms stood out tight beneath his skin. "I fix heating units. Everett, I change brake pads on county vehicles. I do not care about corporate contracts." "You will care when you hear the names sitting on the board of directors," Shaw shot back. "Reed Calder and Malcolm Voss." The names seemed to suck the remaining oxygen out of the room. My dad did not move, but his jaw tightened so hard I thought his teeth might crack under the pressure. I recognized those names. Anyone who looked at government procurement knew them. They were titans. "They built their entire empire on the cover-up we walked away from," Shaw said, his words rapid and sharp like gunfire. "Calder was the private contractor. Voss was the brass who gave him top-level cover. They built their fortunes by burying the truth and burying your men in the sand. Now, they are pushing the exact same business model into the civilian sector. The supply chain Safe Miles is using for those school buses is a carbon copy of the network that pushed counterfeit armor onto the battlefield. "That is not my fight anymore," Dad said. His voice was a steel door slamming shut, barring any entry. "I made my choice. I chose a quiet life. I chose to spend my days making sure the kids in this town actually get to school in one piece. That is real safety. Not some phantom war you want to fight 20 years too late." "Dean, they are using fake structural supports," Shaw pushed, his composure finally cracking, his voice echoing with genuine desperation. "They are using substandard crash paneling and forging the stress test results. If a bus gets hit at an intersection, those side panels will shatter like brittle glass. It is the exact same scheme, the exact same fake materials. They are just trading soldiers for children because the profit margin is higher and the domestic oversight is a joke." "Then take it to the Department of Justice," Dad yelled. It was the first time in my 34 years of life that I had ever heard my father raise his voice. The sound echoed off the living room walls, harsh, violent, and full of decades of suppressed rage. "You wear 4 stars on your collar. Everett," my dad continued, pointing a calloused finger at Shaw's chest. "You have the ear of the Pentagon. You have clearance levels I cannot even imagine." "Do your damn job and leave me out of it." "I cannot," Shaw admitted, the heavy weight of absolute defeat pulling his broad shoulders down. Voss insulated himself perfectly within the advisory boards. Calder has half of the oversight committee in his pocket through campaign donations. The only thing that can break their foundation is the original sin. The proof of the counterfeit armor from the first operation. The proof that the current supply chain is tainted by the same fraudulent engineering. You are the only living man who knows the structural anomalies of that original design. You are the only one who can identify the matching signatures. Dad shook his head slowly, taking a deliberate step backward, retreating toward the kitchen. "No, I paid my price. My family paid the price. I am not digging up a grave just so you can finally feel like a hero." Shaw sighed heavily. He reached down and picked up a slim, black titanium briefcase he had brought in with him. He walked past my father, his heavy boots sounding loud on the hardwood floor, and placed the briefcase flat on our kitchen table. The metallic click of the latches against the table sounded like the snap of a trap closing. "I did not bring this to convince you to be a hero, Dean," Shaw said, his tone turning grim and absolute. "I brought this because you do not have a choice anymore. The walls are already coming down around you." Shaw turned to face both of us. His eyes were cold, calculating, the eyes of a tactician viewing a compromised battlefield. "You think you are hidden here? You think Cumberland Ridge is off the map I found you. And if I found you, the people who want to keep that supply chain running will find you too. There are investigative reporters sniffing around the edges of the Safe Miles contract. There are federal auditors quietly pulling procurement records. But worst of all, Calder knows the ice is getting thin. He is going to secure loose ends. You are the biggest loose end he has left." Dad stared at the briefcase on the table, his eyes dark and entirely unreadable. "Everything you need is in there," Shaw said, buttoning his dress coat with sharp, mechanical movements. "Sealed documents, tainted shipping manifests, flight logs from the original extraction. I am giving you a head start. Dean, use it to fight, or use it to run. But do not think for 1 second that staying quiet will keep you safe this time." Shaw walked past us to the front door. He did not look back. He opened the door, stepped out into the fading afternoon light, and pulled it shut behind him with a solid thud. Through the front window. I watched the general walk down the driveway. He got into the back seat of the black sedan. The heavy engine roared to life, the sound fading down the street until the neighborhood was dead quiet again. But the quiet was different now. It was not the comfortable, sleepy silence of a small American town that I had come home to find. It was the suffocating, crushing stillness of a locked room where a bomb had just been placed on the kitchen table, silently ticking down the seconds until detonation. The air felt too thick to breathe. I looked at my father. He stood motionless in the center of the kitchen, staring down at the black briefcase. He looked older, more fragile, and more terrified than I had ever seen him in my entire life. The clock on the microwave shifted to 11:45 at night. The black titanium briefcase still sat in the exact center of the kitchen table, an anchor weighing down the entire house. My father had spent the last 4 hours trying to pretend it was not there. He wiped down the counters, organized the pantry, and checked the locks on the back door 3 times. I sat in the wooden chair, watching him run from a ghost he could no longer outpace. Finally, he turned off the sink and stood with his back to me, staring out the window into the pitch-black yard. "Sit down," I said. My voice was quiet, but it left absolutely no room for negotiation. He stiffened. "It is late, Naomi. You have a long drive back to the city tomorrow." "I am not leaving," I replied, standing up and pulling out the chair opposite mine. "And you are not going to brush my hair aside and tell me this is just old history, not tonight. The man who just walked out of our house is a 4-star general who said you should be dead. He named the exact company I am investigating for corporate fraud. You are going to sit down, and you are going to tell me the truth." He stood by the sink for a long time. The silence in the kitchen was agonizing. Then, his shoulders slumped, the invisible armor he had worn for decades finally fracturing. He walked over, pulled out the chair, and sat down. He looked at his hands, rough and calloused from years of fixing broken heaters, and took a deep, shuddering breath. "I was never a war hero, Naomi," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was not kicking down doors or leading special operations. I was a captain in a logistics and safety evaluation unit in Iraq. My entire job was verifying whether the equipment the Pentagon bought actually worked. I was an auditor. I did exactly what you do now, just in a combat zone. I read the specifications. I tested the tensile strength of the metals, and I verified that the words of the men in charge would not get my soldiers killed." He looked up at me, and I saw a profound, exhausted sorrow in his eyes. "During a routine field inspection of a new fleet of armored transports, I found an anomaly," he continued. "The vehicles were manufactured by a defense contractor called Cobalt Fleet Systems. On paper, they were state-of-the-art, designed to withstand heavy explosive impacts. But when I cracked open the side panels of the first transport, I found the truth. The ceramic cores inside the doors were completely fake. The blast plating was made of a cheap, substandard alloy that fractured under minimal stress. Cobalt had forged the structural test reports. They were sending us rolling coffins." I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. "You reported it." "I filed a priority petition to halt the deployment of the entire fleet," he said, his jaw tightening. "I brought the physical evidence directly to the command tent, but the man in charge of the sector was Major General Malcolm Voss, and the private contractor liaison pushing the vehicles through was Reed Calder." Hearing those names again, spoken by my own father in our quiet kitchen, made the room spin slightly. "They shut me down immediately," Dad said, his voice hardening with residual anger. "Voss told me to stay in my lane. A massive congressional delegation was arriving in 48 hours. Calder was trying to secure a multi-billion-dollar expansion of his supply contract. A massive safety recall would have ruined the demonstration and tanked the deal. They cared more about the profit margins and the political optics than the men who were going to drive those trucks." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. 2 days later, I found out a convoy of reserve medics and communications specialists was scheduled to roll out to a forward operating base. They were assigned the exact batch of defective Cobalt vehicles I had inspected. I knew if they hit a roadside explosive, the fake armor would turn into shrapnel. It would shred them from the inside out. "What did you do?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. My father was the man who woke up at 4 a.m. to make sure the school gym was warm. He would never let people walk into a trap. I bypassed the chain of command, he said plainly. I forged transit authorization codes, manually locked down the entire motor pool, and physically blocked the exit routes. I grounded the fleet and rerouted the medics onto older, verified transports. I knew it would end my military career, but I saved nearly 50 lives that morning. A brief flash of pride hit me, but it was immediately swallowed by the dark reality of the story. But they punished you for it. Dad closed his eyes, a shadow passing over his face. Voss was furious. My lockdown caused a massive logistical delay. He needed to clear the defective vehicles out of the main base before the congressional delegation saw them sitting idle. So, he ordered a midnight recovery team to move the grounded transports to a secondary location. He sent my men to do it. His voice broke on the final word. He swallowed hard, struggling to maintain his composure. The recovery team was ambushed on the transit route, he said, staring blankly at the dark wood of the table. They hit an explosive device. The fake armor failed exactly the way I knew it would. 2 of my men died. 2 men who trusted me burned to death in the sand, and Voss seized the opportunity. He rewrote the official after-action report. He pinned the entire disaster on me. He stated that my unauthorized lockdown created a chaotic bottleneck that forced the midnight transit, thereby directly causing the casualties. He branded me an insubordinate liability. He made it look like my arrogance killed my own team. That is monstrous, I whispered, gripping the edge of the table. Why did you not fight it? You had the proof of the fake armor. Because they did not just threaten a court-martial. Naomi, he replied, looking directly into my eyes. They threatened your mother. They threatened you. The air left my lungs. It started a week after the ambush, Dad explained, the terror of that memory still fresh in his voice. Your mother began receiving phone calls at our house on base. 2:00 in the morning. No one speaking, just breathing. Then, the envelopes arrived. Someone slipped a photograph under our front door. It was a picture of our house. The next day, there was a photograph of you. You were 6 years old, walking home from elementary school. Written on the back were the exact times you left the building and the exact route you took. I felt a physical chill wash over my skin. I remembered walking that route. I remembered my mother suddenly insisting on driving me every single day, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles were white. Voss and Calder never made a direct threat, Dad said. They did not have to. The message was clear. If I blew the whistle on the cobalt contract, if I exposed the billions of dollars in fraud, my wife and my daughter would pay the price. I was trapped in a cage, and they held the key. So where did Shaw come in? I asked, my voice trembling slightly. Everett Shaw was a colonel then, Dad replied. He was not on the payroll, but he was entrenched in the system. He knew exactly what Voss was doing to me, and he knew I was right about the armor. But Shaw was a company man. He knew the machine was too big to fight, and he knew Voss would absolutely follow through on the threats to our family. Dad looked at the black briefcase again. Shaw came to me with a dirty solution. He said there was only one way to keep you and your mother alive. He offered to use his clearance to enact a ghost protocol. I would sign a confession of gross negligence, accepting the blame for the dead soldiers. In exchange, Shaw would seal the file completely. He would scrub my military record from every active database. I would officially cease to exist in the eyes of the government. You took the deal, I stated. I traded my name and my honor for your lives, he said simply, without a trace of regret. Voss got his clean record, Calder got his billion-dollar contract, and I was allowed to take my family and disappear into the civilian world. I promised Shaw I would never speak of it again, and I would live out the rest of my days as an absolute nobody. A ghost fixing boilers in a town no one cares about. He let out a long, heavy exhale, as if finally dropping a physical weight he had carried for 20 years. That is the truth, Naomi, he said quietly. I am not a hero. I am just a man who knew too much, who got his friends killed, and who surrendered to monsters to keep you safe. I sat perfectly still, processing the overwhelming weight of his confession. The story was entirely devoid of the glamorous, heroic sacrifices depicted in movies. It was a story of systemic, bureaucratic evil. It was about wealthy men trading the lives of soldiers for profit margins, and using the love a father had for his child as a weapon to silence him. I looked at the black briefcase Shaw had left behind. Inside were the echoes of that old betrayal, now wrapping their fingers around a new set of victims. The profound injustice of it all burned hot in my chest, completely erasing the exhaustion I had felt earlier that day. My father had been forced to surrender, but I was not bound by his treaty. I sat across from my father, my hands flat against the cold wood of the kitchen table. A sharp, bitter anger flared in my chest. He had surrendered. He had let powerful men dictate the terms of his existence and allowed a massive lie to bury his own team. But as I opened my mouth to argue, the analytical part of my brain, the part trained to find microscopic anomalies in thousands of pages of corporate data, suddenly took over. The anger shifted. It stopped being about a father who gave up and became about a pattern that was actively repeating itself. I pulled my laptop out of my bag, ignoring his exhausted gaze. I opened the encrypted Bellwether Civic Risk server and pulled up the SafeMiles America master file. I bypassed the polished executive summaries and dove straight into the Tier 3 supply chain disclosures. It was a dense labyrinth of shell companies and holding groups, deliberately designed to obscure the actual manufacturers of the materials. I ran a targeted digital search for the name my father had just spoken. It took exactly 14 minutes to find the ghost. Hidden beneath a corporate umbrella registered in Delaware, listed as a secondary provider for structural composite paneling, was a company called Cobalt Applied Defense. They had slightly altered the name, but the registry number matched the old military contractor. My heart hammered against my ribs. I pulled up the material specification sheets for the new school bus retrofits, the lot identifiers, the technical signature formats, even the specific tensile strength variants of 3.2%. They were chillingly identical to the military procurement logs my father had just described from a war zone 2 decades ago. This was not a ghost story. This was not about digging up a 20-year-old injustice to clear a tarnished family name. This was a live, active threat. The exact same business model that had manufactured rolling coffins for soldiers was currently infiltrating the American public school system. They were taking the exact same fake ceramic cores, rebranding them as impact-resistant civilian safety panels, and selling them to municipal districts at a premium. On Monday morning, I walked through the glass doors of Bellwether Civic Risk at exactly 7 o'clock. The office was empty, the quiet hum of the server room the only sound. I did not hack into anything. I did not cross any legal boundaries. I simply did what I was paid a 6-figure salary to do. But this time, I was not looking to ensure corporate compliance. I was looking for the architecture of a massive fraud. For 3 days, I lived on black coffee and sheer adrenaline. I downloaded thousands of pages of publicly available bidding records, federal safety inspection reports, and corporate tax filings. I built a massive interconnected web on my encrypted external drive. I tracked the money flowing from municipal education budgets straight into the offshore accounts managed by Reed Calder. That was when I found the marketing materials. Calder was not just selling bus parts. He was selling a carefully crafted moral crusade. The SafeMiles America initiative was heavily branded under a massive public relations campaign. The promotional videos featured Calder standing in front of bright yellow school buses, talking earnestly about his dedication to American communities. He explicitly marketed the initiative as a program designed to hire returning veterans and protect school children. It was a sickeningly brilliant cover. He was using the very concept of military honor, the exact honor he had stripped from my father, as a bulletproof sales pitch. I dug into the corporate structure of the initiative. There, sitting comfortably as the chairman of the Honorary Advisory Board, was retired General Malcolm Voss. He was leveraging his military prestige to legitimize the safety standards of the counterfeit armor. But the most unsettling discovery came when I cross-referenced Everett Shaw. I found a business press release from 18 months ago. Shaw had given a keynote speech at a defense contractor gala, publicly endorsing the early development stages of the Safe Miles initiative. He had praised Calder for transitioning military-grade safety into the civilian sector. Suddenly, Shaw's dramatic visit to our house made perfect, cynical sense. He was not acting out of a sudden burst of morality. He had realized the current scheme was completely unstable, and that federal investigative journalists were already circling the fraudulent testing data. If Safe Miles collapsed, the ensuing federal audit would inevitably trace the material supply chain backward. It would lead straight to the original military cover-up. Shaw was not trying to save my father. He was trying to burn the bridge before the fire reached his own pristine reputation. He wanted my father to detonate the scandal on the civilian side to control the blast radius. The deeper I dug, the more I realized the impossible trap I was walking into. Bellwether Civic Risk was the primary independent auditing firm hired to certify the Safe Miles rollout. Our firm was pulling in a $20 million consulting fee to rubber stamp this massive fraud. If I blew the whistle, I would not just be exposing Calder and Voss. I would be initiating a catastrophic federal investigation into my own employer. I would trigger the collapse of municipal transportation contracts in over 40 cities. I would absolutely destroy my own career, forfeit my professional license, and likely face retaliatory corporate lawsuits that would bankrupt me for the rest of my life. On Friday evening, I drove the 2 hours back to Cumberland Ridge. The town was exactly as quiet as I had left it, completely oblivious to the financial and political warfare brewing just beneath its surface. I walked into the house. My dad was sitting in his worn recliner, staring at a blank television screen, looking like a man waiting for an executioner. "I tracked the supply chain," I said, dropping my heavy leather bag onto the hardwood floor. He slowly turned his head to look at me. "Naomi, I told you to let it go." "I cannot let it go," I replied, my voice hard, steady, and stripped of any childhood deference. "Because they did not let it go. Cobalt is still operating. They just changed their letterhead." They are the primary subcontractor providing the reinforced side panels for the Safe Miles school bus contract. They are using the exact same substandard composite materials they used on your transports. My dad stared at me, all the color instantly draining from his weathered face. "Are you absolutely sure?" "I matched the certification templates and the material stress variance codes," I said, walking closer to him. "It is a perfect structural match. They are using the exact same fraudulent data." He stood up, his hands shaking slightly. "You need to walk away from this right now. You do not understand the kind of people you are dealing with. They destroyed an entire military unit to protect their bottom line. If you threaten a multi-million-dollar civilian contract, they will not just send you threatening letters. They will systematically ruin your life." "My life is already built on their lie," I shot back, refusing to give him a single inch of ground. "My firm is auditing their rollout. If I stay quiet, I am officially part of the cover-up. I become the person signing the safety forms for a coffin. I will not let you throw yourself on a grenade for me," he said, his voice thick with a father's protective desperation. "My honor is not worth your future. I made my peace with being a coward 20 years ago." I stopped, looking directly into his tired, frightened eyes. The time for gentle family dynamics was over. "You think this is about you?" I asked, keeping my tone ruthlessly objective. "You think I am trying to win you a medal or clear your old service record?" He blinked, completely taken aback by my coldness. "I do not care about your military record," I said, delivering the words like a physical strike. "I do not care about the ghosts in the desert, and I do not care about Everett Shaw's guilty conscience. But I do care about the fact that in less than 60 days, thousands of children are going to board buses lined with fake armor. If one of those buses gets broadsided at a busy intersection, those side panels are going to shatter into razor-sharp shrapnel. I am not fighting for your past. I am fighting to stop the exact same defective material from ending up on vehicles carrying kids." For the first time since I was a little girl asking about the photograph on the wall. Dean Langley did not tell me no. He did not offer a vague excuse. He did not tell me it was just old history. He stood perfectly still in the middle of the living room. The silence stretched between us, heavy and monumental. It was not the suffocating silence of a man hiding in the dark. It was the tense, vibrating silence of a locked door finally, inevitably, beginning to creak open. The wooden stairs leading up to the attic groaned under my weight. I had gone up there under the pretense of finding old property deeds, searching for any leverage we might have if Calder's lawyers decided to freeze our assets. The air was stale, thick with the scent of dried pine and trapped summer heat. Cardboard boxes were stacked against the sloped rafters, containing the discarded fragments of a life my parents had tried to keep entirely ordinary. I pushed aside a box of my old middle school sweaters and saw a familiar object tucked in the corner. It was an old floral tin box, the one my mother, Claire, used to keep her recipe cards in. She had passed away 5 years ago, taking her quiet warmth and steady hands with her. Seeing the faded painted roses on the tin made my chest ache. I knelt on the dusty floorboards, wiped the grime from the lid, and pried it open, expecting to find her handwritten notes for apple pie and roasted chicken. There were no recipes inside. Instead, the tin was packed tight with microcassette tapes, thick manila insurance envelopes, Polaroid photographs, and stacks of small, yellowed index cards. I pulled out the first card. It was covered in my mother's elegant, looping cursive, but the words made absolutely no sense at first glance. It looked like a grocery list, but the items were paired with strange alphanumeric sequences. Apples, blue sedan, license plate Charlie Kilo 9er 2. Milk, Tuesday, 2:15 in the morning. Silent call. I sat back on my heels, the dusty attic air suddenly catching in my throat. It was a cipher. A brilliantly simple, deeply paranoid domestic code. My mother had known everything, while my father thought he was shielding her by swallowing the military's poison. She had been quietly keeping score. She had documented the terror campaign waged against our family. I pulled out a thick stack of cards. They detailed an agonizing timeline. She had logged the license plates of every unfamiliar vehicle that idled at the end of our street. She recorded the exact times of the anonymous, threatening phone calls that came in the dead of night. There were even notes about men in tailored suits arriving on our front porch, representing Reed Calder. They had brought thick envelopes of cash, described by my mother as support funds for relocation. It was blood money, designed to push my father further into the shadows. Beneath the index cards lay a sealed envelope holding an unsent letter. The paper was brittle. I unfolded it carefully. It was addressed to a lawyer who had died a decade ago. In the letter, my mother detailed a military operation she referred to as Project Ash Lantern. The words painted a devastating picture of the weeks following the ambush that killed my father's men. But the most jarring detail was a paragraph describing Everett Shaw. The letter detailed a night Shaw came to our house on base, long before he wore 4 stars. My mother wrote about finding him sitting at our kitchen table at 3 in the morning, his face buried in his hands, weeping uncontrollably. He had confessed to her that he knew Dean was being sold out, that the armor was rigged, but he lacked the political power to flip the board on General Voss. He was crying because he was choosing his own career over my father's life. Reading that completely shattered the image of the stoic, commanding general who had stood in our living room just days prior. I dug deeper into the tin and pulled out a smaller, square envelope. Inside was a single, clear photograph. It was a close-up shot of a thick composite armor plate, cracked cleanly down the middle. Stamped into the metal was a long sequence of manufacturing numbers. I stared at the sequence. I closed my eyes, recalling the files I had memorized at Bellwether Civic Risk, the prefix codes, the batch identifiers, the specific formatting. It was a perfect match to the serial numbers I had seen attached to the Safe Miles America procurement logs. This photograph was physical, indisputable proof of the origin point. At the very bottom of the tin, beneath the tapes and the envelopes, was one final index card, It was not a log or a coded message. It was a note my mother had written directly to herself, heavily underlined. The ink pressed so hard into the paper it had nearly torn through. If they ever use this on civilians, do not show mercy. A profound, chilling clarity washed over me. For years, I had convinced myself that pushing against the corporate machine would somehow dishonor the quiet, peaceful life my parents had sacrificed everything to build. I thought I would be destroying the sanctuary my mother had died trying to maintain. But sitting in the suffocating heat of the attic, holding that piece of paper, I realized I had it entirely wrong. She did not want peace. She wanted a reckoning. She had just been waiting for someone strong enough to deliver it. I was no longer a daughter rebelling against her father's surrender. I felt deputized by a woman who had lived her entire adult life in the shadow of someone else's violence. I gathered the tin, stood up, and walked carefully down the wooden stairs. My dad was in the kitchen, wiping down the counters with a damp cloth, trying to scrub away a stain that was not there. I set the floral tin down on the table with a heavy, metallic clatter. He stopped wiping. He looked at the tin, recognizing it instantly, and his brow furrowed in confusion. "Why did you bring your mother's recipe box down here?" "Because she was not writing recipes." "Dad," I said, my voice steady but thick with emotion. I opened the lid, pulled out the stack of coded index cards, the unsent letter, and the photograph of the cracked armor plate. I spread them out across the wood, forcing him to look. He dropped the damp cloth. He stepped closer, his eyes scanning the elegant handwriting. I watched his face shift from confusion to absolute shock, and finally, to a devastating, crushing grief. He reached out with a trembling hand and traced the edge of the unsent letter. "She knew," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I thought I kept it from her. I thought I absorbed all of it." "She absorbed it with you," I corrected gently. "She logged every threat, every car, every bribe. She knew about Project Ash Lantern. She knew Shaw sat right here in this kitchen and cried because he was too weak to save you." I picked up the final index card and held it out to him. "Read this. Read what she really wanted." He took the card. He read the words aloud, his voice trembling. "Do not show mercy." His knees seemed to give out. He slumped heavily into a kitchen chair, burying his face in his rough hands. His shoulders shook as a silent, agonizing sob tore through him. All the stoicism, all the rigid walls he had built for 2 decades collapsed under the weight of his dead wife's absolute fury. I stood beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder, letting him grieve for the woman he had underestimated. We stayed like that for several long minutes, the only sound the steady ticking of the hallway clock. Finally, he wiped his face, taking a deep, ragged breath. He looked up at me, his eyes red but carrying a new, hardened focus. The defeated maintenance man was gone. "She was braver than I ever was," he said quietly. "She gave us the map," I replied, "but we need the weapon. This photograph proves the serial numbers match, but Calder's lawyers will argue it is circumstantial. They will say SafeMiles legally purchased the patent rights from a defunct military contractor. We need something that definitively proves the testing data is forged." My father stared at the photograph of the armor plate for a long time. Then, he stood up. He walked past me, heading straight for the hallway utility closet. He reached up to the very top shelf, moving aside old paint cans and stacks of rags, and pulled down a heavy, grease-stained leather pouch. He brought it back to the kitchen table and untied the thick leather cord. He reached inside and pulled out a solid steel cylindrical tool, heavy and dark with age. The end of the cylinder featured an intricate, deeply engraved geometric pattern. "When Voss ordered the cover-up," my father said, his voice dropping into a flat, professional cadence, "he claimed that the entire Cobalt Engineering data vault was destroyed in an accidental fire. He said the original calibration reports and the safety verification seals burned to ash. It was the only way he could legally justify closing the investigation without a secondary audit." He set the heavy steel cylinder down on the table next to my mother's index cards. This is the master technical calibration stamp for that specific deployment year, he explained, looking directly into my eyes. I pocketed it right before they arrested me. I never told anyone, not even your mother. If Bellwether Civic Risk is currently auditing the Safe Miles safety certificates, those documents have to bear a digital reproduction of a calibration seal. My mind raced, connecting the final dots. Yes, every single stress test report requires an authorized calibration watermark. We verify them against the federal database. The seal engraved on this tool, my father said, tapping the steel, contains a deliberate microscopic flaw in the outer ring. It was a manufacturing defect specific to my unit's gear. I noticed it during my very first inspection. If you examine the safety certificates Calder is submitting for those school buses today, and they bear this exact same microscopic flaw, it proves everything. Then those certificates are not just similar, I finished, the magnitude of the discovery hitting me like a physical force. It proves they are direct. Unauthorized copies pulled from a data vault that was legally declared destroyed 20 years ago. Exactly, Pa, he said. The hesitation was entirely gone from his voice. It proves Voss lied to the Pentagon. Calder committed federal perjury, and every single bus they are retrofitting right now is operating on a forged guarantee. I looked at the steel stamp, then at my mother's handwritten note. We had the motive, we had the timeline, and now we had the absolute proof. The empire was going to burn. The local Veterans Hall smelled of stale beer, lemon floor wax, and decades of unspoken regrets. It was closed to the public for the evening, the neon beer signs humming faintly in the otherwise dim, wood-paneled room. Everett Shaw had arranged the meeting off the books, utilizing a private back room usually reserved for local chapter elections. When my father and I walked through the heavy wooden door, the suffocating atmosphere of a post-war reunion hit me instantly. There was no romanticized brotherhood here, no joyful embraces or tearful salutes. The air was thick with the crushing weight of debts left unpaid and truths spoken entirely too late. 3 people sat around a circular folding table. They looked up as my father entered. The silence that followed was agonizing. "Captain," a woman said, her voice rough and raspy. She was Leah Mercer. She had been the signal specialist for my father's unit. Her hair was entirely gray now, pulled back into a tight, severe knot, and the lines on her face spoke of a life spent looking over her shoulder. She did not stand up. None of them did. Beside her sat a nervous, balding man in a faded corduroy jacket. This was Owen Pike, the civilian metallurgist who had originally flagged the armor defects before being quietly blacklisted and pushed out of the defense industry. Across from him sat an older man in a sharp but outdated suit, a former Pentagon legal advisor whose name I did not care to learn. My father stopped at the edge of the table. He looked at the faces of the people he had commanded, the people he had thought he would never see again. He simply offered a stiff, almost imperceptible nod. He took a seat. I stood right behind him, my arms crossed, anchoring him to the present. Mercer slid a thick leather-bound binder across the table. I kept the digital footprints. Dean, I have the checksum logs from the original command stream. It is a tiny string of data, just raw hexadecimal codes printed on thermal paper. But it verifies that your original lockdown orders were manually overridden by General Voss. It proves the chain of command was broken from the top down, not the bottom up. Owen Pike reached under the table and hoisted a heavy, reinforced pelican case onto the plastic surface. He popped the latches with shaking hands. Inside, resting in custom-cut foam, were 4 jagged, heavy chunks of composite core material. "I kept the slag," Pike said, his eyes darting toward the door as if expecting Calder's men to burst through at any second. "These are the rejected core samples from the cobalt manufacturing line. I smuggled them out of the testing facility the night before they fired me. I have held on to them for 2 decades. It became an obsession. I knew if I threw them away, I would be throwing away the only physical proof that we were right." "And you?" I asked, looking directly at the former Pentagon lawyer. My voice was sharp, slicing right through the heavy nostalgia in the room. The lawyer adjusted his tie, refusing to meet my eyes. I was the junior counsel assigned to Everett Shaw. I want you to know, Miss Langley, that Shaw fought the Phantom Protocol. He argued violently with the Joint Chiefs. He did not want to authorize the paper death of your father. But General Voss brought us the audio recordings of the threats made against you and your mother. Voss made it perfectly clear that if your father went to trial, your family would not survive the week. I drafted the ghost paperwork because it was the only legal maneuver left to pull your father out of the blast radius. I looked at the three of them, and then I looked at Shaw, who stood silently in the corner shadows. I did not feel a single ounce of warmth or forgiveness. The late confessions did not soften my anger, they only sharpened it. Sitting at this table was the uncomfortable, terrifying truth about how systemic evil actually functions. Voss and Calder were the architects, but these people were the gears. Good, terrified people who compromised their morals, hid their evidence, and signed fraudulent papers because they were afraid of losing their careers or their lives. Their fear had bought my father 20 years of silence and had left my mother to die checking the license plates of strange cars outside our home. Your apologies are 20 years late, I stated coldly. My mother died carrying your secrets. Do not ask us for absolution now. Mercer looked down at the table, accepting the blow without flinching. We are not here for absolution, Naomi. We are here because there is something else. Something Dean never knew. My father looked up, his brow furrowing. What do you mean? The ambush on the recovery team, Mercer said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. It was not a random insurgent strike, and it was not bad luck. The room went entirely still. I was monitoring the encrypted regional frequencies that night. Mercer continued, her hands gripping the edge of the table. A few hours before your men moved the defective transports, someone in Voss's communications team broadcast the exact transit schedule, the route, and the cargo manifest. They broadcast it in the clear, unencrypted, straight into the local civilian channels. My father stopped breathing. What are you saying? Leah, I am saying Voss fed your men to the wolves, Mercer replied, tears finally pooling in her hard eyes. He needed the defective armor destroyed before the congressional inspectors arrived, and he needed a scapegoat. He leaked the coordinates to ensure the convoy was hit. It was an execution. Dean, Voss orchestrated the murder of your team. A horrifying sound escaped my father's throat, something between a gasp and a physical choke. The realization that his men were not casualties of war, but victims of a calculated corporate assassination, threatened to break him completely. But Mercer was not finished. There is a twist. Dean, Corporal Hayes knew something was wrong before they rolled out. He did not trust the sudden midnight transfer. A few hours before the ambush, Hayes created a secondary, localized backup drive of the entire logistics server. Every file, every forged test result, every piece of correspondence between Voss and Calder. Where is it? I demanded, stepping forward, my analytical mind immediately seizing on the tactical advantage. Hayes stashed it in a secure locker at a domestic civilian staging warehouse, Mercer explained, an old Cobalt facility just outside of Baltimore, where the gear was held before shipping overseas. Hayes mailed me the locker key from the base right before the convoy left. I received the key 3 weeks after he burned to death in the sand. I was too terrified to ever go looking for the building. She reached into her pocket and placed a small, brass padlock key on the table. I immediately pulled my laptop from my bag, set it on the table next to the chunks of fake armor, and tethered it to my phone's cellular connection. I accessed the National Property Registry and ran a historical trace on the old Cobalt staging facility. My fingers flew across the keyboard as the others watched in stunned silence. 14 years ago, I narrated, my eyes scanning the cascading lines of data. The Baltimore staging warehouse was officially decommissioned by Cobalt, but it was not sold on the open market. It was transferred to a holding company called Apex Logistics. 5 years after that, Apex was acquired by a real estate trust. I traced the trust's corporate officers, cross-referencing the names against the Bellwether Civic Risk database I had downloaded over the weekend. "The real estate trust is managed by a proxy firm," I said, looking up at the group. "And that proxy firm is a direct, wholly owned subsidiary of Safe Miles America. Reed Calder owns the building. He bought the land to ensure no one could ever accidentally demolish that warehouse or open those old lockers. They are guarding the grave." The room fell into a heavy, oppressive silence. We had the key. We knew the location. But walking into a property owned by the man who had ordered the execution of American soldiers was akin to walking directly into a loaded gun. My father stared at the small brass key resting on the plastic table. He slowly reached out and picked it up. His hand was no longer shaking. The crushing weight of the guilt he had carried for 2 decades seemed to evaporate, replaced by a terrifying, absolute resolve. He looked at Everett Shaw, then at Mercer and Pike, dismissing them entirely. He turned his head and looked at me. He was no longer the protective, terrified father trying to shield his little girl from the dark realities of the world. He was an exhausted witness who had finally run out of patience for the masquerade. "Pack your bag, Naomi," my father said, his voice hard and hollow, devoid of any warmth. "We are going to Baltimore. We are opening that door." At 8 o'clock on Monday morning, my company phone rang. It was the head of human resources at Bellwether Civic Risk, informing me that I was being placed on an immediate, indefinite suspension. The charge was a supposed violation of internal data protocols. I had not downloaded a single classified document or breached any legal firewalls. But the reality of corporate warfare was that truth did not matter. Only leverage did. They locked me out of the server, remotely wiped my company devices, and subtly threatened my pension. Calder and Voss were flexing their muscles, cutting off my access to the battlefield before I could even draw a weapon. But the retaliation did not stop at my career. It bled directly into the quiet streets of Cumberland Ridge. By Tuesday afternoon, the local school board received an emergency notification of a sudden, comprehensive financial and safety audit from the state level. It was a thinly veiled threat to freeze the district's funding. Then, the strangers arrived. Small towns have a specific, steady rhythm, and any disruption is instantly noticeable. There were suddenly unfamiliar cars idling near the town square. Men in sharp suits sat at the corner diner, drinking black coffee and asking the waitstaff casual, probing questions about the school maintenance manager. A pair of aggressively polite reporters appeared at the edge of the school property, claiming they were doing a profile on rural infrastructure, but their cameras were pointed squarely at my father's workshop. The suffocating paranoia of 20 years ago had returned, entirely intact, as if it had never left. I felt the constant, prickling sensation of being watched from the shadows. The true escalation, however, happened on Wednesday night. My father came home 2 hours past his usual schedule, the moment he walked through the front door. I knew something catastrophic had occurred. His face was ash gray, his hands trembling so violently that he could barely hang his canvas jacket on the hook. He walked straight into the kitchen, leaned heavily against the sink, and gripped the edges of the porcelain until his knuckles turned white. "Dad, what happened?" I asked, my pulse immediately spiking. He stared out the dark window for a long moment before speaking. "Bus number 7. I was doing a final perimeter check of the motor pool before locking the gates. I noticed a dark puddle spreading across the concrete underneath the rear chassis. Someone slipped under the fence and completely severed the main hydraulic brake line. The words hit me like a physical blow. A severed brake line on a school bus. If I had not stayed late to reorganize the tool shed. His voice cracked, laced with a terrifying mix of anger and absolute horror. The morning driver would have fired up the engine, loaded 30 kids into the cabin, and realized at the bottom of the steep hill on County Road 4 that she had absolutely no way to stop. This was no longer a battle to reclaim a buried military record. It was an active, ruthless silencing campaign playing out in our backyard. Calder and Voss were sending the exact same message they had sent 2 decades ago. They were perfectly willing to kill innocent people to protect their supply chains, and they would gladly frame my father for the resulting tragedy. A sharp cold fury seized me, but my analytical mind immediately searched for the leak. We had kept our circle impossibly small. There was only one person with the connections, the access, and the established habit of manipulating the board. I grabbed my phone, dialed the encrypted number we had been given, and demanded Everett Shaw meet us at the house. He arrived an hour later, stepping into the kitchen with a grim, defensive posture, before he could even offer a greeting. I backed him into the corner. "You sold us out again," I stated, my voice shaking with unadulterated rage. "My company suspended me. State auditors are strangling the school district, and someone just tried to sabotage a bus full of children. Calder knows exactly what we are doing, and he knows exactly where we are." Shaw did not deny the escalation, but he shook his head vehemently. "I did not leak your location to Calder, Naomi. He has a private intelligence firm on retainer. They flagged your server queries at Bellwether. I am the only reason you are not currently sitting in a federal holding cell on fabricated espionage charges." "Then why are his people crawling all over this town?" my father demanded, stepping forward. The fear of the severed brake line turning into a dangerous aggression. Shaw let out a heavy sigh, looking older and more exhausted than ever. "Because I intervened with the federal investigators. I used my clearance to place a temporary hold on the Justice Department's preliminary inquiry into the Safe Miles contract. You stopped the feds from investigating them," I practically screamed, unable to comprehend his logic. "I slowed them down by 72 hours, Shaw fired back, his authoritative voice booming through the small kitchen. "If the Justice Department marched into Calder's offices today with a subpoena, Calder would immediately initiate a full digital scrub. He would burn the Baltimore warehouse to the ground within an hour. You have the key to the physical evidence, but you have not retrieved it yet. If I let the feds move now, Calder destroys the proof, and the entire case turns into hearsay. I am trying to manage the timeline so you can actually secure the weapon before the war officially starts. You are still trying to manage the truth." "Everett," I spat back, thoroughly disgusted by his endless tactical games. "You cannot control an evil machine by asking it nicely to pause. Your management just put 30 kids in the crosshairs." Shaw tightened his jaw, accepting the blow. But the damage was already done. The psychological warfare had taken its toll on my father. He looked at me, then at Shaw, and the fierce resolve he had found just days ago seemed to crumble under the sheer weight of the collateral damage. "They are coming after the town," my dad said, his voice dropping into a hollow, defeated whisper. "They are going to bankrupt the school district, and they are willing to hurt the kids I'm supposed to protect. I cannot let another group of innocent people get caught in the crossfire because of my past. It is happening all over again." He was retreating. The deeply ingrained trauma of losing his soldiers, of watching my mother live in fear, was pulling him back into the shadows. He believed his silence was the only currency that could buy the town's safety. I watched him mentally prepare to surrender the key, to let Calder win a second time, simply to keep the monsters away from Cumberland Ridge. The next morning, the heavy atmosphere of defeat hung over the house. My father put on his work jacket, determined to go to the school and officially resign, hoping that severing his ties would make the corporate hounds lose interest in the district. I followed him out to his truck, desperately trying to find the words to stop him. As he reached for the door handle, a worn silver minivan pulled up to the curb. A woman stepped out. It was Sarah Jenkins, a local nurse whose 2 young sons rode bus number 7 every single day. She looked exhausted, holding a crumpled local newspaper that featured a vague, speculative article about the sudden state audit and the safety concerns surrounding the district's vehicles. "Dean," she called out, walking over to the driveway. "I read the paper. People are talking. The PTA is in a panic. They are saying there is something wrong with the new safety retrofits, that the state might pull our funding." My father looked down at his boots, unable to meet her eyes. "Sarah, I am handling it. I am stepping down today. The audit will clear up once I am gone. The school will be fine." Sarah stopped a few feet away from him. She did not look relieved. She looked at the heavy, defeated posture of the man who had kept her children warm and safe for a decade. "Dean, look at me," she said, her voice completely devoid of the usual small-town pleasantries. It was the fierce, unyielding tone of a mother. He slowly raised his head. "I do not care about the state funding," Sarah said, staring directly into his eyes. "I do not care about the politics, and I do not care what the school board has to do to balance their books. If there is something wrong with those buses, if those parts are not safe, you do not walk away. I would rather lose the contract than lose my child." The silence that followed was profound. The morning air felt completely still. It was such an ordinary sentence, spoken by an ordinary woman standing in a suburban driveway. Yet, it sliced straight through 20 years of convoluted military justifications, corporate blackmail, and manufactured guilt. It completely dismantled the lie Voss and Calder had used to control him. My father had spent 2 decades believing that hiding the truth was the ultimate act of protection. But Sarah Jenkins just handed him the absolute reality. Hiding the truth was not protection. It was complicity. I watched the exact moment my father's perspective permanently shifted. The ghosts of the desert finally released their grip on his shoulders. He was no longer fighting a lost war for his tarnished honor. And he was no longer fighting to avenge my mother's silent suffering. He was fighting for the families standing right in front of him. Only this time, he finally understood that he could not survive on silence. He let go of the truck's door handle. He looked at Sarah, a new, unbreakable clarity hardening his features. "Your kids are going to be safe, Sarah," he promised, his voice carrying the quiet, lethal weight of a man who had finally stopped running. "I swear to you." He turned back to me. He did not say a word about resigning. He just looked at me and gave a single, sharp nod. The hesitation was dead. We were going to Baltimore. The drive to Baltimore took just under 4 hours. I was not about to jeopardize the admissibility of our evidence by committing breaking and entering. Early Thursday morning, I hired a local commercial real estate attorney. We exploited a defaulted mechanical lien from 12 years ago against the shell company holding the lease. By 2 o'clock in the afternoon, we stood in front of the rusted corrugated metal doors of the warehouse with a county sheriff and a licensed locksmith. It was entirely legal, painfully bureaucratic, and completely bulletproof. The locksmith drilled the heavy deadbolt. The sheriff cleared the empty building, and then we were left alone in the cavernous, echoing dark. The air inside tasted of oxidized iron and decades of undisturbed dust. We bypassed the empty pallet racks and headed straight for the administrative offices built into the back wall. We found discarded ballistic plates stacked in the corner, crumbling at the edges. A dusty cardboard box held a dozen prepaid cellular phones, their batteries long dead. But the room seemed devoid of the specific locker Mercer had mentioned. I noticed a massive, faded map of the eastern seaboard pinned to a corkboard. It was improperly mounted, bulging slightly in the center. I pulled the corkboard down. Hidden within the drywall framing was a flush-mounted, heavy steel fireproof safe. The brass key Mercer had given us fit perfectly into the manual override slot beneath the digital keypad. The heavy bolts retracted with a solid, metallic thud. I pulled the heavy steel door open. Inside, resting on the top shelf, was a thick, rubber-encased external hard drive, the lost backup from the desert. Beneath it lay a stack of thick manila folders. I pulled them out and spread them across a dusty metal desk. My breath caught in my throat. These were not just old military files. They were fresh, recently printed purchase orders. They bore the Safe Miles America letterhead. They detailed the procurement of the new civilian safety panels. But the supply chain tracking numbers routed directly back to the exact same defunct cobalt material identification codes. Calder had been using this forgotten vault to bridge the paper trail between his old treason and his new empire. Then, I saw the blue folder at the bottom of the stack. I opened it, and the air completely left my lungs. It was an official Department of Defense legal waiver. A sworn affidavit. I scanned the dense legal text. It was a complete, Unconditional admission of gross negligence. It stated that the unauthorized transport lockdown was a paranoid, insubordinate mistake that directly caused the fatal ambush. And at the bottom of the page, signed in dark blue ink, was my father's name. I stared at the signature. The lines of the letters were sharp and familiar. A profound, sickening dizziness washed over me. I looked up at my father, who was standing on the other side of the desk. He had not just been a passive victim of a corrupt military machine. He had not just been buried alive by Everett Shaw's phantom protocol. He had picked up the pen and deliberately signed the document that nailed his own coffin shut. He had given Voss the exact piece of paper needed to legally close the investigation forever. "You signed it," I said, my voice barely a whisper, dropping the folder onto the metal desk. "You actually confessed to it. You put your name on the lie that ruined your men." My father looked at the blue folder. He did not look surprised. He looked like a man who had been waiting 20 years for the executioner to finally swing the axe. He walked around the desk, his boots heavy on the concrete floor. "I told you I was a coward, Naomi," he said, his voice stripped of all defense. "But I did not sign that paper because of a vague phone call. I did not sign it because of a photograph slipped under the door." He reached out and touched the edge of the affidavit. 3 days after the ambush, Calder sent a man to my temporary housing unit on the base. The man sat down at my kitchen table. He did not make a single threat. He just reached into his jacket and placed a photograph of your elementary school on the table. Then, he looked me dead in the eye and recited your exact morning routine. He knew you left the house at exactly 7:15. He knew you wore a yellow raincoat on Tuesdays. He knew you stopped at the corner of Maple and Elm to pet a stray dog before crossing the street. He told me the dog's name, and then he slid that affidavit across the table and handed me a pen. My dad looked up at me, his eyes shining with a profound, unshed grief. I signed it before the ink in his pen was even warm. I would have signed 1,000 of them to keep that man away from you. The anger that had been boiling inside me instantly evaporated, replaced by a crushing, hollow sorrow. The image of my father, the unwavering protector of Cumberland Ridge, was not destroyed by this confession. It was brutally humanized. I finally understood the absolute, paralyzing terror that had bought our quiet, normal life. Every single day of my childhood, every wooden birdhouse he built, every quiet evening on the porch, had been purchased with the agonizing knowledge that he had surrendered his soul to keep me breathing. He had swallowed poison every single day so I could grow up safe. The sound of heavy footsteps echoing through the warehouse broke the silence. Everett Shaw walked into the office, his uniform replaced by a dark civilian suit. He looked at the files scattered across the desk, noting the hard drive and the signed affidavit. "I told you I was slowing down the federal agents to give you time to arm yourselves," Shaw said, walking closer and placing a small digital audio recorder on the desk. "But I was also hunting for my own ammunition. I knew Voss would be monitoring the situation. I baited him into a secure phone call yesterday evening. I suggested that Dean might be getting desperate enough to talk to the press." Shaw pressed the play button. The tinny, arrogant voice of Malcolm Voss filled the dusty room. "You are panicking over nothing, Everett." Voss's recorded voice sneered. "Langley is a broken dog. He will not say a single word. I bought his silence 20 years ago when I put a target on his little girl's back. Langley will always choose his daughter over the truth. And that is exactly why we win." The recording clicked off. The echo of the tyrant's voice faded into the cold walls of the warehouse. I looked at the items assembled on the rusted metal desk. The puzzle was completely assembled. We had the original motive trapped inside the old hard drive. We had the indisputable evidence of current, ongoing fraud in the Safe Miles purchase orders. We had the recorded, explicit admission of guilt and extortion from the mastermind himself. And we had the physical proof that their criminal network had never actually ceased to exist. It had simply put on a different uniform and moved into the civilian sector. The truth was no longer a ghost story. It was a loaded weapon, and I was finally ready to pull the trigger. I stared at the lost hard drive and the signed affidavit resting on the rusted desk. A lesser strategist would have immediately called a national newspaper, handed over the files, and watched the chaos unfold. But my years of analyzing corporate risk had taught me a harsh reality about men like Reed Calder. Releasing the evidence to the press would simply trigger a massive, drawn-out legal war. Calder would deploy an army of defense attorneys, file endless defamation suits, and tie the evidence up in jurisdictional disputes for the next 10 years. Safe Miles America would quietly rebrand its shell companies and continue installing the exact same defective armor into school buses under a different name. I did not want a messy, prolonged legal battle. I wanted them exposed in full view of everyone they had lied to. I wanted the blow to land in the exact place where Calder and Voss expected to be crowned as heroes. The Redstone Civic Safety Summit was scheduled to begin in exactly 48 hours. It was the absolute pinnacle of Calder's public relations empire. The summit would be packed with 5 state governors, major corporate donors, local school board representatives, and a massive contingent of the regional press. The central event of the entire weekend was the public signing of the Multi-State School Transportation Agreement. They were going to stand under bright stage lights and receive standing ovations for protecting children. That was my stage. I needed to make sure Calder felt completely secure walking into that spotlight, which meant I had to feed his supreme arrogance. I used a burner phone and a sympathetic contact still working inside Bellwether Civic Risk to plant a highly targeted, heavily encrypted rumor that I knew Calder's private intelligence team would intercept. The message was perfectly crafted bait. It stated that Dean Langley was physically exhausted, terrified of federal retaliation, and fundamentally broken. It suggested that he was willing to hand over the original Cobalt files and sign a permanent non-disclosure agreement, provided his daughter was financially secured and his family's honor was left intact in the shadows. It was a trap built entirely on their own psychology. Calder and Voss had spent their entire lives believing that every single human being had a breaking point and a purchase price. They bit the hook within 2 hours. The coordination was absolute and entirely off the books. Everett Shaw utilized his remaining capital to bring in a specialized team of federal procurement investigators who operated outside the standard Justice Department hierarchy. Leah Mercer handled the encrypted audio frequencies, and the local real estate attorney drafted the fake settlement paperwork to make the bait look legitimate. But I maintained total operational control over the final strike. I was the architect of the trap. My father agreed to wear a concealed digital transmitter for a private, pre-summit meeting with Calder. However, as the federal technician taped the microscopic microphone to his chest in a dark van parked outside the hotel, my father grabbed the technician's wrist and delivered his absolute condition. "Listen to me very carefully," my father said, his voice low and dangerous. "I will get them to talk. But if Calder or Voss even hints at using the schools, the children, or the staff of Cumberland Ridge as pawns in this negotiation, the wiretap ends. I will not let my town be used as leverage. If they threaten my people again, the meeting is over right there in the room, and I do not care what the federal agents outside have to say about it." The lead investigator nodded slowly, understanding completely that my father was no longer a man who could be commanded. At 3 o'clock on Friday afternoon, my father walked into a luxury penthouse suite at the Redstone Grand Hotel. I sat in the surveillance van parked 3 blocks away, a heavy pair of headphones pressed tight over my ears, listening to the feed alongside Shaw and the federal agents. Calder greeted my father with the sickening warmth of an old fraternity brother. "Dean, it has been far too long," Calder said, his voice smooth and entirely devoid of guilt. "Please, take a seat. Let us finally put this ugly business behind us." Calder played the benevolent billionaire perfectly. He operated like a man who was entirely used to buying silence. He did not yell or threaten. He simply laid out a briefcase on the glass coffee table. He offered $5 million, placed into an irrevocable, untraceable trust fund under my name. He offered to use his political leverage to quietly restore my father's military pension and rank. He smiled and promised to let everything end nicely. as long as my father handed over the key to the Baltimore warehouse. Then, a digital chime echoed through the audio feed. Malcolm Voss joined the meeting via a secure, encrypted video link from his private estate. "Are we actually negotiating terms with a mechanic?" Voss sneered through the suite's speakers. His voice dripped with an absolute, aristocratic contempt. "You spent 20 years hiding in boiler rooms and bus lots. Langley, you spent your life sweeping floors and fixing rusted radiators while we shaped the entire geopolitical landscape of this country. You threw away your command for absolutely nothing, and now you come crawling back for a payout because your blue-collar knees are finally giving out." Voss weaponized the quiet, honest life my father had built. He treated my father's decades of humble, dedicated labor not as a profound sacrifice to protect his family, but as a shameful, pathetic failure. In the van, I clenched my fist so hard my nails dug into my palms. But my father played his part flawlessly. He did not rise to the bait. He let his shoulders slump. He spoke with the hollow, defeated tone of a man who had finally given up. "I just need to know why," my father asked, his voice sounding perfectly broken. "Why use the exact same defective ceramic cores for the school buses? You have billions of dollars now. You secured the contracts. You could easily afford to use real, verified armor. Why put the kids at risk?" Calder let out a soft, patronizing sigh. "It is simple economics, Dean. The legacy material supply chain was already established, fully integrated, and completely off the federal radar. Switching to a new, legitimate composite supplier right now would reduce our overall profit margins by 14%. We are a business. Dean, we maximize our returns. The statistical probability of a catastrophic side-impact collision on a civilian bus route is incredibly low. It is an entirely acceptable risk to maintain the bottom line." There it was, the absolute, unvarnished motive. My father pushed one final time, carefully steering the conversation toward the last target. "What happens when the federal auditors realize Everett Shaw helped you forge the Phantom Protocol? What happens when they realize he buried the files for you?" Voss laughed. A harsh, grating sound. "Shaw is a coward who cares more about the polished stars on his collar than anything else in the world. He signed the paper to bury you too. Langley. He facilitated the lie. He is tied to the exact same anchor we are. If we drown, he drowns with us. He will never say a word against us because he would be signing his own arrest warrant." In the surveillance van, the lead federal agent immediately reached for his tactical radio, preparing to order the breach team into the penthouse. They had everything they needed. They had the confession of ongoing fraud, the admission of the previous cover-up, and the explicit confirmation that the criminal network had merely changed its uniform. I reached out and slammed my hand down on the agent's radio, pinning it to the metal table. "Do not send them in," I ordered, my voice sharp and absolute. The agent glared at me. "We have the confession on tape, Miss Langley. We have them dead to rights. We are moving in. If you arrest Calder in that hotel room right now, his lawyers will have him out on bail in 2 hours." I fired back, staring the federal agent down. "The indictment will be sealed. The defense team will tie the audio recordings up in closed-door evidentiary hearings for the next 5 years. The public will never hear a single word of it. And Safe Miles will just quietly replace Calder with another empty suit and keep the contracts running." I looked at the audio monitors, feeling a cold, calculating calm wash over me. I had the weapon, but I refused to fire it in the dark. "I am not letting them hide behind a quiet federal indictment," I said, my voice leaving absolutely no room for debate. "I want to bring this empire down in public. We let Calder walk out of that room believing he won. We let him put on his tailored suit. We let him walk right onto the main stage at the summit tomorrow morning." The main ballroom of the Redstone Grand Hotel was bathed in the harsh, triumphant glow of hundreds of flashbulbs. It was Saturday morning, the closing session of the Redstone Civic Safety Summit. The stage was set for a coronation. Reed Calder stood behind a polished acrylic podium, wearing a perfectly tailored navy suit, absorbing the applause of 5 state governors, dozens of corporate sponsors, and a massive contingent of regional press. On a giant digital screen behind him, Malcolm Voss looked down upon the crowd via a live satellite feed, projecting the untouchable aura of a decorated military icon. They were exactly 5 minutes away from signing the largest multi-state school transportation agreement in history. Calder had just finished his sickeningly eloquent speech about honoring our veterans and protecting our most precious cargo, our children. He motioned toward the wing of the stage, expecting me to walk out and deliver the final, rubber-stamped compliance audit from Bellwether Civic Risk. Thanks to a sealed federal subpoena pushed through by our back-channel investigators, my suspension had been temporarily overridden. Granting me the official podium slot, I walked out onto the stage. I did not smile. I did not shake Calder's outstretched hand. I walked directly to the presentation console, plugged in my encrypted drive, and bypassed the approved corporate slideshow. The massive digital screen behind Calder and Voss suddenly shifted. The glossy Safe Miles America logo vanished. In its place appeared a dense, complex web of corporate shell companies. Thick red lines connected the current civilian procurement accounts directly to the defunct military contractor, Cobalt Fleet Systems. A wave of confused murmurs rolled through the massive ballroom. Calder lowered his hand, his perfectly practiced smile faltering slightly. "Miss Langley, I believe you have pulled up the wrong file," he whispered, leaning toward my microphone. "I have the exact right file. Read," I said, my voice echoing loud and clear across the silent auditorium. I clicked the presentation remote. The screen changed to display the photograph of the shattered composite armor plate, side by side with the current purchase orders for the school bus retrofits. "These are the structural failure rates of the materials you are selling to our public schools. They hold a 98% failure rate upon high-velocity impact. And right in the center of your safety certificates is a forged technical calibration stamp, copied directly from a vault you swore burned to the ground 2 decades ago." The murmurs turned into sharp gasps. Calder's eyes darted toward the exits, his survival instincts finally overriding his arrogance. "Turn off the projector," he yelled at the sound booth. "This woman is a disgruntled, terminated employee. She is having a mental breakdown." "She is not broken," a deep, gravelly voice echoed from the side of the stage. "And neither am I." Dean Langley stepped out from the shadows of the wings and walked directly into the blinding glare of the spotlights. The entire ballroom seemed to stop breathing. Calder physically stumbled backward, knocking over his glass of water. On the giant screen above, Malcolm Voss turned the color of old parchment, his eyes widening in absolute, paralyzing terror. For 20 years, they had told the world, the military, and themselves that this man had been erased from history. But here he was, standing right in front of the cameras, wearing a simple flannel shirt and his heavy work boots, a living, breathing testament to their buried sins. "My name is Dean Langley," my father said, taking the microphone from my hand. His voice was steady, carrying the quiet, unbreakable strength of a man who had nothing left to lose. 20 years ago, these 2 men ordered me to deploy defective armor to my soldiers. When I refused, they set up an ambush that killed my men, blamed me for the casualties, and threatened to murder my wife and daughter if I did not legally cease to exist before the room could erupt into total chaos. Everett Shaw stood up from his seat in the front row of the audience. He unbuttoned his dress uniform jacket, signaling the end of his own career. "I am General Everett Shaw," he announced, his commanding voice cutting through the rising panic in the room. "And I corroborate every single word this man just said. I personally authorized the phantom protocol that buried his file. I was a coward, but I am submitting a digital audio recording into the official congressional record today, featuring Reed Calder and Malcolm Voss explicitly confessing to extortion, fraud, and the intentional use of legacy defective materials to increase their current profit margins. It was a flawlessly coordinated avalanche. We did not give them a single second to breathe, to spin the narrative, or to call their lawyers." Leah Mercer stood up in the third row, holding high the thick binder of thermal paper. I am the signal specialist from his unit. I have the original encrypted communication logs, proving General Voss leaked our transit coordinates to the enemy. Owen Pike stood up next to her, slamming the heavy Pelican case onto a press table and pulling out the jagged chunk of fake ceramic core for every camera lens to see. I am the original metallurgist. I have the physical proof they forged the stress tests. From the back of the room, my hired local attorney began handing out thick stacks of paper to the frantic journalists. And I have the handwritten diaries and coded logs of Claire Langley, documenting 20 years of continuous surveillance, anonymous threats, and corporate bribery engineered by Reed Calder to keep this family silent. The entire structure of their empire was collapsing in real time, right in front of the governors they had tried to buy. Calder, desperate and sweating profusely, grabbed a spare microphone. "This is an elaborate smear campaign," Calder screamed, his voice cracking violently. "They are trying to destroy a contract that will save children. None of these buses are in danger." I stepped right up to Calder, looking him dead in his panicked eyes, and delivered the final, fatal blow. I clicked the remote one last time. "That is your biggest lie of the day, Reed," I said coldly. The screen shifted to display 3 finalized shipping manifests. According to your own internal logistics servers, 3 different school districts in the tri-state area have already received and installed these high-risk retrofits just this year. You have already put thousands of kids inside those rolling coffins. That was the breaking point. The audience was no longer composed of passive politicians and polite investors. Half the room was filled with local parent-teacher association representatives and school board officials. The absolute horror of realizing their children were currently riding in compromised vehicles ignited a collective, explosive fury. Parents began shouting, surging toward the stage. The lead state inspector, who had been sitting at the ornate signing table with a gold pen in his hand, literally threw the pen onto the floor. He stood up, grabbed the master contract, and ripped it entirely in half before the final ink could even be applied. "The agreement is frozen," the inspector shouted over the chaos. Effective immediately, federal agents, wearing dark windbreakers, poured out from the backstage corridors. They flanked Calder, stripping the microphone from his hand and locking heavy steel handcuffs around his wrists right there in front of the flashing cameras, on the giant screen. The legal team surrounding Malcolm Voss frantically lunged forward to cut the satellite feed. But the image of the great, untouchable general looking small, terrified, and utterly defeated was already permanently burned into the public record. The aftermath was swift and absolute. Dean Langley's military file was officially reopened by the Department of Defense. The criminal referrals for Calder and Voss included procurement fraud, wire fraud, extortion, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. They would spend the rest of their natural lives in federal prison. When the Pentagon offered my father a full public ceremony to restore his rank and award him the medals he had been denied, he politely but firmly refused. He did not want their old, tarnished glory. He had only 2 non-negotiable demands. First, that every single school district that had contracted with Safe Miles receive an immediate, federally funded replacement of all defective equipment. Second, that the names of his 2 teammates who died in the desert be read aloud on the floor of the Senate, properly honored as men who died protecting the truth, rather than buried under the red ink of a cover-up. It was not a loud, chaotic victory. It was a cold, clean, structural execution. The men who had stolen my father's normal life lost their empire, their freedom, and their complete control over the narrative. A week later, I stood in the quiet living room of our house in Cumberland Ridge. The heavy, suffocating tension that had occupied this space for 2 decades was completely gone. The air felt light. I watched my dad walk over to the living room wall. He did not take down the old, sun-faded photograph of him standing in the desert. It belonged there. It was the truth. But right next to it, he hung a brand new picture in a simple wooden frame. It was not a picture of a battlefield or a military medal. It was a photograph taken just yesterday morning, right here in town. It showed a long row of bright yellow school buses rolling out of the maintenance lot at dawn, their exhaust pluming in the crisp air. They were thoroughly inspected, structurally sound, and truly safe. My father stood back, looking at the two photographs side by side, his hands resting comfortably in his pockets. The heavy silence was gone. The ghosts were finally at rest, and the quiet. Ordinary life he had fought so hard to protect had finally been returned to the right hands. Thank you so much for listening to this story, and I would love to know where you are tuning in from today. So please leave a comment below to share your thoughts and let us connect. If you enjoyed this journey, please subscribe to the Helena Revenge Stories channel. Like this video, and show your support by hitting the hype button so this story can reach and be heard by many more people.